Let's go ahead and get started on our history of Stone Park. And first off, let's start. One of the things that makes Stone Park such a unique resource for Sioux City is the geological history of the park and the resources that it has. And so I think we need to start out with going through some of the formative events that created this really unique landscape that we have right inside Stone Park. So one thing that we as Sioux City residents, one of our things that we are very lucky to have is this big 800 plus acre public park right in our city limits, and we've had it for well over 100 years. And it's an area that has had only limited development in its history, and so it's very much in its natural state. And it's just a really unique resources to have right at our beck and call at any time, right inside our city. But the first thing that shaped the land that today is Stone Park, we have to go back about 66 million years to the Cretaceous period, and between 66 million and 100 million years ago, basically the center of the North American continent was underwater. Sea levels were much higher at that time, and it was a shallow sea called the Western Interior Seaway. And sometimes it was bigger, sometimes it was smaller, and that affected the bedrock that underlays Sioux City itself, but particularly is able to be viewed in Stone Park. Stone Park's one of the few places in northwest Iowa where we see exposed bedrock. That's not common in our part of Iowa because of the wind-blown loess soil that covers the surface of our land, and so we have some opportunities there. So at certain points, the eastern shore of the Western Interior Seaway was right on top of what today is Sioux City and Stone Park, and we'll see that left behind a certain type of bedrock. And then at other times, the Western Interior Seaway was bigger, and the shore was actually over more into central and eastern Iowa, and the Sioux City area was under about 200 feet of water, and that deposited a different type of rock that we'll see. And so that's kind of the earliest thing that shaped the land that is today Stone Park. So the first thing that I think most of us know about is as you drive along Highway 12 past what today is Stone Park north of Riverside, is that there's these great outcroppings of what are sandstone and granite shale. And these are deposits that were put down when the Western Interior Seaway basically had its shoreline right through this area. And so if you can imagine, there were small rivers coming down into that, draining into that seaway, forerunners of maybe the Missouri River or the Floyd River, whatever. And they would leave behind silt, and these built up layer on layer. And so that left behind that depression when Highway 12 was put through there. The road crews cut through and left behind these great exposures of that material. And so you'll find things like seashell fossils in there sometimes, or fish fossils, and so it's just that alternating of sandstone and shale, which are both river-type deposits. The other thing that we have available in Stone Park is what's called greenhorn limestone, and this was deposited when the shoreline was farther to the east, over in central to eastern Iowa. And so when there was about 200 feet of water over this area, as your things that are like different types of brachiopods like clams and oysters and stuff would die, and their shells would fall to the bottom and settle on the bottom of the sea, built up this limestone. And this is where you really find a lot of marine fossils in that limestone. And most of this exposure is in the area where the Stone Park shelter is today, just to the west of that. And so that's one of the few places where we have a really good limestone exposure in our part of Iowa. Here's just another picture of that greenhorn limestone, and so this is something that has been used a little bit for economic purposes in Sioux City that we'll touch upon later. But for the most part, it's just been fascinating from a geologic point of view, natural science point of view. Now, the biggest thing that shaped the landscape in our area, in Stone Park in particular, was glaciation. So about 2.5 million years ago or so, Earth started undergoing repeated ice ages, and points where glaciers would form over the North Pole and extend way down over the top of what today is present-day Iowa. Now, here in the northwestern Iowa, this area hasn't been glaciated for a long time. The basically a lot of the subsoil in our part of Iowa is from what is called the Kansan Drift or pre-Illinoisan Drift. And this is stuff that was deposited between 2.5 million and 200,000 years ago. So it's a pretty long time ago. And that's one reason why our part of Iowa is very hilly, where a lot of north central Iowa is flat. Well, that was glaciated not that long ago, about 12,000 years ago or so. And so that hasn't had time to erode away the way that our part of the landscape has. And you can see on this map that what they call Kansan Drift here, that also extends down into southern Iowa. And when you think about southern Iowa, as you're driving across Interstate 80, that's rolling hills and such that like we have here. And so we have similar landscapes in both parts of Iowa, and that was left behind by the glaciers. So that's one thing that was deposited here. And there is an exposure of what is called Kansan glacial drift. So when you think about it, these glaciers, they could be a mile thick, 2 miles thick. They were enormous. And as they ground over what today is Canada and northern Minnesota, and the granite that you find up there when you're up in that area, they just ground that rock into it just pulverized it into basically silt or fine-grained clay. And it was just deposited when those glaciers stopped advancing southward and started to melt. They left behind all that ground up what became soil. And so that's a lot of the subsoil in our part of Iowa. And you can see in this picture, you might notice there's little dots, and that's pieces of rock that's in that glacial drift. And that differs from Loess soil, which does not have that, because Loess soil is although that is also glacial in origin, it's formed in a different way and doesn't have the larger pieces of stone in it. And now then we get to the Loess soil, and that's really that's the thing that really makes our part of Iowa unique, is that Loess is something that's only found in a few places in the world, and it's formed under very unique conditions. So if you can imagine, the Loess in our area was formed between about 31,000 years ago to about 12,500 years ago, when the last glacial period came to an end. And imagine when those ice sheets were melting, what today is the Missouri River was much larger. The entire valley that is the Missouri River was basically one big waterway in this area. So it was more like a lake than it was a river. And so that whole valley, as the water level started to go down, left behind a very fine-grained silt that had been just ground to just tiny microscopic particles so small that you can barely see them with an electron microscope, and left it behind all over what today is the Missouri Valley. Well, of course, as we know here, for instance, last weekend we experienced this. The wind blows like crazy in this part of North America, and it tends to blow out of the west, either the southwest or the northwest. Well, when that fine-grained silt was there, it was just like snow, and it was very easy for the wind to just blow up into big piles, and that became what we call the Loess Hills along the Missouri River, especially the western side of the Missouri River that run from northern Iowa all the way down into Missouri. And we have a really great example of that in today's Stone Park. And Loess is really unique stuff because it has all kinds of interesting properties. When it's easily eroded, but when it erodes, it'll stay in almost a vertical bank, as we know from our road banks around here, and it'll stay in that vertical position for decades, even though it's just dirt. A lot of different other types of dirt would just kind of melt away from the weather, but Loess doesn't do that. It's unique in that way. So now let's get into the historic period. So Sioux City began to be organized in the winter of 1854, 1855, and the land that today is Stone Park underwent various types of ownership. And the first person whose name is attached to it is a guy named Charles Rouleau. And Charles Rouleau he actually wasn't an American citizen. He was a French-Canadian fur trader. The French-Canadian fur traders, another well-known one in this area was Théophile Bruyère, or Théophile Bruyère, depending on how you like to pronounce his name, that we know pretty well from Sioux City history. There were about 30 of these guys that were involved in the fur trading industry between Native American tribes and U.S. fur manufacturers for, they'd turn the furs into coats and hats and things like that. And Rouleau was one of these types of guys that came to what became Sioux City in the late 1840s, early 1850s. And after 1856, there was a land claims office in Sioux City, and Rouleau apparently staked a claim in at least some of the land that is today Stone Park. So he's one of the first ones. And if you recognize the name Rouleau, way down in it'd be very south, it'd be southeastern Nebraska, is a tiny town called Rouleau, Nebraska, and he and his wife founded that after they left the Sioux City area in the late 1850s. Now, one of the things that was constructed out of material coming from the Stone Park area was what was called the Academy of Music. And the Academy of Music was Sioux City's first big municipal auditorium. And it was on 4th Street, on the south side of 4th Street between Pierce and Douglas Streets. And this was the first big public venue. It seated about 800 people, and it was a brick building, but it was built on a foundation, a limestone foundation that came from the quarries of Charles Borowski, who had a short-lived limestone quarry out in what became Stone Park, in that greenhorn limestone. He was quarrying that and selling it as building material. And so the Academy of Music was a great place. It was where, for instance, when Susan B. Anthony came through in the 1870s to talk about women's suffrage, that's where she would speak, or any prominent speaker or any type of traveling show or such would talk at the Academy of Music. Another person whose name is attached to land in Stone Park is Isaac Pendleton. And Pendleton's best known in Sioux City as one of our early district court judges, and he was a lawyer, and many people in his family thereafter were also judges and lawyers. But there were a whole host of people whose names are attached to land in what today is Stone Park, but Pendleton is one that stands out. But the most important person that was involved in the development of what became Stone Park was Daniel Hector Talbot. And Talbot is one of the real interesting guys in Sioux City history. He's just a fascinating person in a number of ways. First off, he was born in Iowa City, grew up in Iowa City. His dad had been a school teacher who got into the brick industry. And Talbot initially intended to get into the brick industry too. And because of our lush soil, Sioux City was a great place to make bricks. And he came to Sioux City in 1870 to learn about the brick industry and to kind of work his way up in that. Well, while he was working in the brick industry, this is in the period right after the Civil War, and he found out about opportunities to be had by selling what was called government land scrip. And land scrip was something that the U.S. government had been issuing to war veterans since the Revolutionary War, because oftentimes the government didn't have the funds on hand to pay cash to war veterans. So they were given different types of promissory notes in lieu of payment, or they were given land scrip, and oftentimes it was title to land out in the West that hadn't been settled. And so places like western Iowa were places where this land scrip would be issued. And oftentimes, people that lived in the East, they really had no interest in coming out to western Iowa in the 1850s, 1860s to settle. And so they were looking to sell, this land that they were entitled to for whatever they could get for it. And of course, it wasn't necessarily worth all that much, but if you accumulated a lot of the land scrip, it was something that you could make a lot of money in. And so people like Talbot, who got into this business, would buy the land scrip for a little bit and resell it at much greater prices. As Sioux City was growing, that land became more and more valuable, and he became a millionaire as a result of working in that business. As a result of that, began acquiring land. And throughout the 1880s into the early 1890s, he acquired about 800 acres of what became Stone Park. Now, I have a host of images that are what what the Stone Park area would have looked like in Daniel Talbot's time. And so in this picture, we're facing south across a ridge in Stone Park. And you can see at that time that it was not as heavily wooded as it is today. That's something that, for instance, the Department of Natural Resources works pretty hard on trying to clear out those ridges on top of the hills to make it more like it was in its natural state. Originally, the trees were kind of confined to the valleys, and the hills were open and were grasslands, and so they were like meadows between the trees in the valleys. And you really get a sense of what the Loess Hills are like in their natural state. You can see how they really do look like snowdrifts as you look off into the distance. And you can barely see way down here is the Big Sioux River running to meet to the Missouri River off in the corner. And here's another view, only this time we're looking back to the east, and you really get a sense of how the Loess Hills extend out into the distance, and what makes it such a unique landscape. And now, keep in mind, before white settlement occurred in Sioux City, this land had been important to Native American groups for 13,000 years. And they had been coming to this area for the very same reason white settlers came here. The rivers were a natural meeting point for people, a point for trade. So there were several village sites that have been found over the years, going back several thousand years in the Sioux City area, and different types of artifacts have been discovered pointing that out, and so that's another thing that makes the Stone Park area very important, is that it's a preserved area that hasn't really been messed with too much since the time that Sioux City was founded. Now here we have another view where we're looking off to the northwest. This view you can see on the sides. Because there's no trees, you can see how the Loess Hills do their natural cat step type of erosion. So when the Loess Hills, that's one thing that are known for it, because they tend to stand vertically as they're eroded. They'll form these natural cat step formations along their edges as you go down, and so that's very indicative of the Loess Hills formation. You can see an animal trail, maybe originally a buffalo bison trail of some type that maybe later cattle used that Talbot had turned out there. And then off in the distance, you can see the Big Sioux River making its way off to the north. Now, Talbot was, as I said, he was an interesting guy. He was really interested in natural science. And in the late 1800s, this was a time when a lot of upper middle class Americans and Europeans were really interested in the natural world and studying it from a scientific. They were amateur scientists, and he was an amateur naturalist of a sort, anyway. And he was very interested in the idea of breeding different like hybrids of different types of farm animals, but also crossing different types of related species if he could. He was also interested in doing this with plants, so both plants and animals. And so something that he would do was he would search out for specimens of animals that had some type of mutation. And so, for instance, this elk is an animal that Talbot owned, and he collected him because he had unusual antler formation. And so then he would try to figure out, what was going on. And at this time, this is just the beginning of when the idea of genes and things like that were going on. So people like Talbot were kind of behind that, although he wasn't a truly professional, trained scientist. But Talbot got into all kinds of wildlife. His favorite things to do was go on these big hunting trips where he would go off into western Nebraska or all over the place, and he'd basically shoot a bunch of waterfowl and bring home specimens. And this is his home. His permanent home was at 813 Virginia Streets, and that's where he had his real estate office also. And he basically had a natural history museum right in his house. And so this is a picture from that, and he had these cases where he had all of his bird specimens, or he'd have rock specimens in there. So he was a very quirky guy. So another experiment that Talbot had was the idea of crossing cattle with bison and creating beefalo he was not the only one that was interested in that, of course, but he found that crossing bison with Holstein cattle, so Holstein cattle being kind of the classic milk cow, was really effective. And so these are some of his beefalo that were a cross between bison and Holstein cows that he had managed to breed. Another sort of failed experiment he had was the idea of bringing in Texas Longhorn cattle into northwest Iowa. And unfortunately, I don't have a better photo of it, but these are one of his Texas Longhorns. He really liked the idea of the newer breeds of cattle like Herefords that were kind of coming into the market, but he didn't think they were quite tough enough. And so he wanted to mix in some Texas Longhorn into that lineage to make them a little hardier and be able to withstand the Iowa winters. And so he hired somebody to drive some Texas Longhorns all the way from Texas up here. And so you can see this poor guy, he's very skinny. And so that was a long march all the way from Texas. But he managed to get some Texas Longhorns up here that way. Here's some sheep that he had. He would purchase these sheep from people or specimens like these sheep, and you can see they had very odd horn formation on these sheep. They also have very different coats. The one on your left has more of a mohair type coat, where the other one's more of a traditional sheep wool. They very badly need to be sheared. Another thing that was found during Talbot's time, he established gradually a farm out in what today is Stone Park, and they were digging, in 1888, they were digging a cistern for his farm, and they came across this vertebra that we have on display out in our permanent exhibit, and it is a reptile vertebra of a plesiosaur from the time when the Western Interior Seaway was over this area. And so it's an example of evidence of water being over this area in former times. As I said, he was also into hybrid of breeding different types of plants, and of course corn was one of his focus, and he was really early into the idea of hybrid corn. This is well before Pioneer seeds and such, and so he was crossbreeding different types of corn and coming up with different varieties already in the 1880s, early 1890s, and so this is some of his hybrid corn that he had come up with. Now, I have a few different invoices from his company. He called his farm Cosmos Park, and on it, he talks about all the different kind of exotic animals that he has for sale. But at the bottom, it says, it would be hard for you to read, but it says something to the effect that if you know of or know anybody that has animals with interesting mutations, to tell him right away, and he wants to buy them because for his different investigations that he was doing. Here's another pamphlet. He kind of developed his park into a little cottage business where he happened to have in the area where the greenhorn limestone was had an artesian well that was high in mineral content, and he started selling bottled versions of that water as mineral water, of healthful mineral water. And so here he lists the analysis of the different types of minerals that you find in his mineral water that he was collecting out on his farm. And over time, he gradually built up a bunch of different structures out in what today is Stone Park. And this is one of them that being constructed around 1890. This was his big, it looks like a barn, but it was really his library. He called it his library. And he did have a massive library of mostly he had books on law and stuff, but it was mostly scientific literature that he was interested in collecting. And so that's what that building is. And there were several different big similar sized structures out there. We don't know this for sure, we think his farm was centered right about where the main Stone Park shelter is today. So that's kind of the idea of where we think it's hard to tell exactly where things were over time because nobody really wrote down exactly where all his stuff was. Now, the good times didn't last forever for Mr. Talbot. He was heavily invested in real estate speculation, as most of the big business people here in Sioux City were in the late 1880s, early 1890s. And when there was a stock market crash in 1893 called the Panic of 1893, and it just devastated real estate values in Sioux City. And so almost everybody that was involved in real estate speculation went broke at that point. And it was really devastating to Sioux City overall, and to Daniel Talbot in particular. So he was left with a big debt to Sioux City's First National Bank, and he had a $94,000 lien put on his property, which he was unable to pay. And so now keep in mind, Talbot, because of his eccentric behavior and the things he was doing with animal experiments and stuff, he wasn't popular with everybody in Sioux City. And different times people would sneaking onto his farm and try to burn down his barns and you know, kind of crazy stuff like that. But then when the panic happened, Talbot decided to just leave town, basically. And so he packed up, especially his library of books, during the night and took off. And his books all ended up at the University of Iowa, since he was from Iowa City. And so that's where most of that stuff went. And then the property ended up in possession of the First National Bank. And the First National Bank was under the control of Thomas Stone. So here we're going to get to the Stone Park idea. And so basically, First National Bank and the Stone family ended up owning Talbot's farm after 1893 or so. And the father, the president of First National Bank, Thomas Stone, put his son Edgar in charge of that property. And Edgar developed what had been Talbot's farm into a couple of different things. One was Minnewasaca Park, and then there was another one that he called Melhurst Park. But between 1895 and 1911, the Stone family did different things to develop the former Talbot farm into kind of a camping area and an entertainment and recreation area. Another person involved in this development was Dr. Richard Ricketts. And Ricketts was born in Liverpool, England, and he came to the United States in the late 1850s, and his family in the early 1880s settled in Lamars. And most of you probably know Lamars was started as an English colony, and so his family was one of the original Lamars people from England that established the community. Well, in 1884, he came to Sioux City to work for Talbot as a land surveyor, and eventually became his personal secretary. And Ricketts was interested and trained in natural science, and so he eventually was put in charge of Talbot's farm. And after Talbot went away from the scene, the Stone family kept Ricketts on to manage their operations of Minnewasaca and Melhurst Park. And so Ricketts ended up managing what was those operations, and then when Stone Park was established, he continued on as the caretaker until his death in 1933. So Ricketts is very much attached to the history of Stone Park in its early days. And here's a picture of, this is on the edge here on your left is Lillian Ricketts, Richard Ricketts' daughter, and some of her friends walking around on what today is Stone Park. And you can see in the distance is Talbot's library / barn that we saw earlier in its full construction. So here are a couple of invoices from the different operations the Stone family had going on out there, and you can see on the side they were talking about, they are also talking about the medicinal springs that are out there, but they also have things like cabins to rent, and you could do boat excursions on the Big Sioux River from there. So they had a dock onto the Big Sioux River off of the western side of their land, and it was just a place to go and relax. And so here's an example of some of the boat excursions you could do on the Big Sioux River. Most of the pleasure boating in Sioux City in the late 1800s, early 1900s was done on the Big Sioux River. And I think that was because the Big Sioux was just a nicer place to take a boat than the Missouri was. The Missouri was pretty untamed in those days, and so the Big Sioux was a more attractive place to do your boating. And so they would load up these big craft, and you can see it's a steam powered boat. It's got a steam pipe on it, and yeah, obviously there weren't very strong regulations about how many people you could cram onto one of these boats. And they would take these boats basically as far as they could on the Big Sioux River. They would take them well past well past up past Westfield and Akron, and then come back to Sioux City. And so that was just a fun thing that you could do. Here's another invoice for the Melhurst Park, and you can tell they were kind of running that as more of it was a place you could pasture your cattle, you could rent land to do that, and they also sold certain types of hybrid cows and hogs and things like that, and they were still selling their spring water. And here's the one photo that we have that shows the Melhurst Springs. And again, we don't know exactly where this was, but we think it's in the area where Stone Park Lodge is today. And you can see they had a little building built over, and they actually had a little water trough coming out where the water would run out, and you could take your horses right up to it, and they could drink out of the trough as you were loading up your bottles with Melhurst Springs water. And so that's kind of a fun photo. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a very good picture of Mrs. Stone, of Lucia Stone, but Edgar died in December of 1911. Edgar Stone did, and when he did, it was his wife, Lucia, decided instead of hanging on to the property, she wanted to sell it, or she wanted to give it to the city of Sioux City as a public park. And so she did, but Lucia only owned half of the land that had been Talbot's farm, so she owned about 400 acres. And then Edgar's sister, who was Alice Day, she had inherited the other part of Talbot's land, and Alice had passed away in 1907, but her descendants decided in 1912 to sell her part of the farm to the city of Sioux City. And so by 1912, Sioux City controlled all of what had been Talbot's farm, and they created a public park out of it and named it Stone Park in honor of the Stone family that had brought that together and brought it into public ownership. And one of the first things they did was start developing a zoo out in Stone Park. And you'll oftentimes see references to Stone Park Zoo in the early 1900s. Started in 1913. In 1915, they purchased some bison from a ranch up in South Dakota. And so here were the bison they had. And over the years, they collected a variety of animals. And the zoo was always located right along where the west entrance off of Highway 12 is to Stone Park, kind of the main entrance off of Highway 12. It was right along that area. And so that's where they would have these. And over time, they had a variety of mostly small animals. They had a raccoon. At one point, they had some eagles. They had bears oftentimes. At one point, they had as many as 5 bears of different types. And so you can kind of see the rear end of a bear here. But they had a monkey and all kinds of different animals over time. And as late as 1938, they had managed to get a 5th bear at that point from a zoo up in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and so this was the bear that they brought in. But the zoo gradually declined. First off, when the Sioux City turned the park over to the state of Iowa in 1935, the state didn't want anything to do with the zoo, and so they made them move the animals off of the park property. And so a local businessman, and I haven't figured out exactly who it was, gave the people that were running the zoo a strip of land next to the park that they were able to continue running the zoo. And so from 1935 until late 1940 or early 1941, the zoo continued, but it seems to have gradually went away with once the U.S. entered World War II. The zoo kind of went away, and I haven't really figured out an exact date for that, but that's definitely what happened. The city talked about reestablishing the zoo at War Eagle Park somewhere, but it never happened. So the other thing that Stone Park is well known for is the home of Sioux City's Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. And really the Boy Scouts, which were first formed nationally in 1910, had been going out to Stone Park on excursions and camping trips really from the time it became a public park. And as you go through newspapers in the early 1900s, the Boy Scouts are always, I've read accounts where they would gather at City Hall or at somewhere in downtown Sioux City, and then they would hike all the way out to Stone Park and do a camp and then come back later. And so, kids were a little tougher back in 1915 or so. But so they would do things like that. But finally, in 1921, the Boy Scouts actually got control of some land in Stone Park and developed it into what they called Camp Kellogg. And Camp Kellogg was named after Lawrence Kellogg, who was an early Sioux City Boy Scout who had passed away in 1918, and so they named it in his honor. And the Camp Kellogg was always right along where today Turtle Lake is out in Stone Park. And when you walk around in Turtle Lake, you see evidence of where there were cabin buildings and different structures in that area, and that's because of where the Boy Scouts were for all those years. And so the Boy Scouts developed all kinds of things out here. Here you can see a little suspension bridge that they had built across the gully, and of course cabins that they had. And then the Girl Scouts, they used Stone Park for many decades as well. The Girl Scouts were formed in 1920, and right away they started using Stone Park too. And oftentimes the Boy Scouts would let them use Camp Kellogg for different activities at first. And so here we happen to have a great collection of early Girl Scouts out, Sioux City Girl Scouts out in Stone Park. And so here they're out camping out there in 1923, and they're probably on land that was Camp Kellogg at that time where they're camping. And they had a little swimming hole that they had built out there, and so they're using that. I believe this is probably in the area where Turtle Lake is today, but this isn't Turtle Lake as we know it today. But the Girl Scouts liked it out there enough that in 1924, they got their own section of land to I guess it'd be to the south of where Camp Kellogg was, and they developed what they called Camp of the Hills, or Camp O' the Hills. And so then that was the main Girl Scout camp for many decades in Sioux City. In 1926, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts got together and built one of the first swimming pools in Sioux City. And so here we have that. And if you look closely, unfortunately, it's not a real clear picture, but you can kind of see the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts are using it at the same time, so they're sharing that swimming pool. And eventually, the Girl Scouts built their own swimming pool after World War II in 1946. Now, another thing associated with Stone Park is Memorial Drive, and Memorial Drive is the road you come in into the east entrance from the east side. And of course, Memorial Drive is an extension off of Stone Park Boulevard. You turn off onto Memorial Drive, and that's what takes you into Stone Park. And Memorial Drive was established right after World War I, and originally there were 114 trees that you can see planted there, and that was for each of the Sioux City area people who died in service during World War I, and so hence why it's called Memorial Drive. Now, of course, the onset of the Great Depression caused problems with running things like a big city park like Stone Park, and the city was having more and more difficulty to funding that and taking care of it. And so in 1935, they had an opportunity to turn it over to the state of Iowa, which they did in July of that year. And right at that same time, Stone Park became one of the big Civilian Conservation Corps projects in the Sioux City area. And so the Civilian Conservation Corps was one of the main New Deal projects under Franklin Roosevelt to help combat the Depression. And most of the time, the CC CCC was really young men. It was focused on young men that had just graduated from high school, or maybe had dropped out of high school and needed something productive to do. And so they would get them into the CCC, and they would work on parks and other public properties and improvements. And they would live in very much a military type situation. And so outside of Stone Park, after the CCC took over, was a camp with barracks was built, and this was right across, kind of to the northwest from across Highway 12 from where the west entrance is to Stone Park, right in the field that's right across the road. And so you can see they had a little parade ground in the middle, and then there are different barracks that they lived in. And the CCC was great for a kid that was in a situation where his family didn't have any money, and so he had a job, and they had to send home almost all of the money they made because they got fed by the CCC. And so it helped the family. And so usually people working in the CCC were very young, between, say, 18 and 22 or so years old. But out in Stone Park, there was an exception. Almost all the CCC workers that worked out there were actually World War I veterans that were unemployed. And so, because for a long time when we would look at the series of photos and we knew it was CCC workers, they're listed as, but they look like middle-aged guys kind of working out there. They didn't look like what you'd think of as the typical CCC worker. Well, it's because they're in their late 30s, early 40s, or 50 years old or so, and they had served in World War I and had gotten work with the CCC out in Stone Park. And so these workers are clearing a path for one of the roadways out in the park. And they did all kinds of things. So pretty much everything that we enjoy out in Stone Park today, from the main roads that you can drive through to the different hiking paths, for a long time they had some rustic bridges that you could cross. Here's an example of that, and the different stone bridges and things. And of course, all of the structures, especially the ones that are made out of quartzite stone, were all built by the Civilian Conservation Corps between 1935 and 1939 or so. So here we have a picture with the main Stone Park Lodge under construction, and so that was completed in 1936. So that was one of the first big structures to be completed, and so they tried to make the structures out of things that were available here in the Sioux City area, and so they chose Sioux Falls quartzite as the main thing to build out of, which we have a lot of buildings in Sioux City constructed out of that, and it's quarried just to the north of us in the Sioux Falls, South Dakota area. Here's the completed west entrance to Stone Park that you still go through to this day, just completed in 1937. And you can't really tell, but I believe the zoo was off in this area. You can't really tell in this photo, but that's roughly where the zoo would have been before the state kicked them out. Now, later, the CCC built what became the Rangers Lodge. Originally, it was called the Custodians Lodge, but the conservation, the State Conservation Board, or the Department of Natural Resources official that ran Stone Park and took care of Stone Park, to this day lives in the house. And this is right as you come in from the east. It's right off to the north as you drive into Stone Park from the east. And right next to it is a maintenance facility made out of the same, a maintenance shed that's made out of the same Sioux Falls quartzite. And here we have a picture of one of the early custodians of Stone Park, Eugene Cutler, and so he's sitting on top of of one of the entrance structures as you come in on the west entrance to Stone Park. And so he was kind of the first guy to really take care of the park for the state of Iowa. And here we have one of the later structures completed was the Dakota Point Shelter, and you can still walk up or drive up to Dakota Point, but the shelter is no longer there. It had been damaged pretty bad by vandals, and I believe in the 1990s it was torn down. So you cannot. That's one of the structures you see here that you can't see today. In 1940, a different New Deal organization, the Works Progress Administration, paved Memorial Drive. So originally, Memorial Drive was a gravel road coming into the east entrance of Stone Park, but in the late 1930s, the WPA provided funds to make it a hard surface road up into the park. So here we have some dignitaries celebrating the completion of that. And then probably the last structure to be completed in Stone Park was the toboggan slide. This is one of the more mysterious structures that were out in Stone Park. For a long time, we couldn't figure out where the heck the toboggan slide was. And I have given this presentation a couple of times out of Dorothy Pico Nature Center, and we figured out that the toboggan slide is right off of their main drive. It was right off their main drive as you drove up into the into Dorothy Pico. And to this day, when you walk off, there's a little observation deck right to the north of the entrance to Dorothy Pico. And when you look down that observation deck, you can see the foundations of where this toboggan slide was originally at. And so it opened in 1940, and of course, right away there was a lawsuit because somebody got hurt going down the toboggan slide. And I can't tell that it operated very long. I could not figure out exactly how long it was around. I don't think it was around very long, probably because of those those kinds of things. But I have heard that there was a little shed off to the side of it that housed the waterworks, because they could actually run water right down the slide and make it icy to make it even faster and more dangerous. And that was there for quite a long time. People that I talked to remembered that little watershed. And finally, as we'll get into a little bit, I don't have too many photos from the later years of the park at this point, but hopefully someday we'll have more. But one of the later things to be built out at Stone Park was what we call Turtle Lake today. And that was a project in the 1960s. In 1964, the DeHaan family, who owned land right adjacent to the Camp Kellogg, where the Boy Scouts were, gave some land and allowed the city or the state to construct a dam to dam up the little creek that ran through that ravine, and it created what we call Turtle Lake today. So that's a little man-made lake that we have out there for fishing and things like that. And of course, Turtle Lake, because people would dump their turtles into Turtle Lake and their goldfish and everything else. But became a much well-known and much loved little plot of water out in Stone Park. And here we have some Boy Scouts using it, Turtle Lake, fairly soon after it was built. Now the Boy Scouts continued to use Camp Kellogg until through 1972, and at that point they had expanded the local Boy Scout council, and they decided to move their camp to a larger area. And so then the Girl Scouts continued to use Camp of the Hills then for a few more years until 1977, when they purchased land up north of Stone Park, which is called Joy Hollow, which they still use. And so at that point, then the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts ended their association with Stone Park on an official basis anyway, and that land reverted back to then just as parkland that everybody can use, and kind of completes the development. The other thing I would say as I wrap up here, the last kind of stage of development was the creation of the Dorothy Pico Nature Center, which is on parkland. It's state-owned land that the Woodbury County Conservation Board leases and for the Nature Center. And so that's its own development, but it is part of Stone Park itself, and has a very similar mission. And today, gradually, they've developed trails and things that connect right with Stone Park's trails, and so they're very much integrated opportunities today that you can kind of freely go between both. And so Dorothy Pico Nature Center is kind of the place where you can get more in-depth interpretation of kind of what I've been talking about today from people that are much more expert in the natural history part of it, or the natural science part. But I guess with that's my last slide. I do want to, does anybody have any questions?